Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you for joining us for another segment. In this segment, we're going to be speaking with returning guest, Dr. Jeffrey Cohen. He's joining us again from the Cleveland Clinic to speak again on some highlights from the 8th Joint ACTRIMS-ECTRIMS Conference, Virtual Conference 2020. Welcome back, Dr. Jeffrey Cohen.
Well, thanks for inviting me back.
Great. Well, for our listeners who may not have been with us when you were here before, give us a little bit of your background and talk about your role there at the Cleveland Clinic.
Well, so I am a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic. I'm a professor in the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine and a staff physician at the Cleveland Clinic's Mellon MS Center, where I, in addition to patient care, am the director of the Experimental Therapeutics program.
Of course, research is ongoing. This current COVID-19 pandemic has thrown lots of normal procedures into total disarray. Could you talk with us a bit about what it is that you do there at the Cleveland Clinic as far as multiple sclerosis research, and then talk about some of the ways that this current pandemic has given new opportunities or delayed research in ways that were not unanticipated?
Well, so we have, in addition to a very large clinical program where we see lots of patients both for neurologic care, but also rehabilitation, health psychology, and so forth. We also have a large clinical research program where we're involved in clinical trials of a wide variety of both disease therapies and symptomatic therapies. So, like everything else, the COVID-19 pandemic has really disrupted all those activities. In terms of the clinical program, we had already been pursuing teleneurology, distance health approaches, and in March we pretty abruptly switched from in-person visits to almost exclusively virtual visits. We've now and actually, it went better than we expected. Once we became facile with the various platforms and patients got used to talking to us with images on the computer, the visits went pretty well. And we were able to maintain care and continuity throughout this whole maelstrom. We've now gone back to in-person visits, but it's still about 1/3 virtual and 2/3 in person. So I think teleneurology is something that's here to stay. So that's one opportunity. The pandemic sort of forced us to develop those capabilities, but it's turned out to be very useful because we have a lot of patients that travel a long distance or are disabled, and it's very difficult for them to come into the office. In terms of research, we had all the same problems. Basically, our clinical research program got put on hold for a while. It's now opened up, but we had studies that were in startup that kind of went into limbo. We had studies that were enrolling and following participants that got put on hold for a number of reasons. One was that we wanted to avoid the risk of participants coming to the health facility and potential exposure to infection. But also, it was unclear whether some of the interventions we were testing were safe and might increase susceptibility to the infection or the severity of COVID-19. So it really disrupted things. And I think the same opportunity that we talked about for clinical care presented itself for research, which is it's forced us to rethink: do all patients need to come for every visit in person for a clinical trial, or can we do some of this at a distance?
when you were here with us previously, we talked about the difference in this year's conference, the Joint ACTRIMS-ECTRIMS conference. This year is going to be virtual. Are we going to hear anything in this upcoming conference about some of the lessons learned from this pandemic as far as research is concerned, and some of the opportunities to better research that may have come from this COVID-19 pandemic, some of the lessons?
Yeah, so I think there'll be a lot of discussion about sort of the mechanics of doing research. I've been involved in a number of discussions about that. And a lot of it has talked about are there ways of assessing participants in research studies that don't require them to come in person to the study site? Can we have, as it were, virtual clinical trial visits? Can they? Are there ways of gathering other data, other objective data that can be done at a distance? The other issue that's come up quite a lot, and there'll be a whole session at MS Virtual 2020 about COVID-19 and MS, is how does multiple sclerosis or its treatments affect susceptibility to COVID-19 or the severity of the infection? And then conversely, how does the infection or the pandemic affect MS and MS care? And it turns out, thankfully, that MS and for the most part its treatments don't seem to affect the risk of COVID-19 or the severity of the infection. But the pandemic has affected MS like a lot of other chronic diseases. The infection itself can sometimes trigger an MS flare-up. But more importantly, people have been avoiding care. They've not wanted to come in for office visits. They don't want to go for MRIs. They don't want to go for blood tests. They're not going to physical therapy or health psychology, and those things all have repercussions. So MS is not unique. There's been a lot of discussion that care for heart disease, hypertension, cancer, diabetes has also suffered because people just aren't going for routine care.
This isn't the first pandemic that we've been through. Do you think that once this pandemic is over or considered to be not as much of a threat as it is today, do you think COVID-19 considerations will remain in place for research and treatment options going forward, whether or not there's a pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So, we had talked previously about our switch to teleneurology, and I think that's going to remain an emphasis. We found that it's actually very advantageous to not require people to come to the office for every visit. So I think that's here to stay. Our experience with the combined ACTRIMS-ECTRIMS meeting has made us question whether these in-person conventions are necessary, and I think we can convey the information, the research results pretty well. What we haven't, I think, completely figured out is how to recreate the interactions, the networking that we do in person. And then I think the other thing we've learned from this pandemic is that one of the main determinants of infection, risk of the infection and the outcome of the infection are things like comorbidities, so general health, people that have heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and so forth, they do worse. And also the social determinants of health turn out to be a very important factor in whether someone gets COVID-19 and how they do when they get it. People that don't have the luxury of staying home, they have to go to work and get exposed potentially to infection. People that don't have access to medical care. That turns out to be one of the main determinants of how someone does with COVID-19. So even after the pandemic's over, we're going to have to address that issue.
Well, we'd like to learn some more about this year's conference and more about ACTRIMS. Where can we go online and get some more information?
So I would recommend people just Google ACTRIMS, ACTRIMS. That'll take you right to the ACTRIMS website, and there'll be also a link to the MS Virtual 2020 meeting website.
Great. Well, Jeffrey, thank you. Always a pleasure speaking with you. I'm hoping we'll speak again in the future.
I'd love it. Thanks for the invitation.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with returning guest Dr. Jeffrey Cohen. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.